Okay, like I said, let's start by taking some basic moral beliefs. It's wrong to eat babies. It's wrong to enslave other human beings simply because they don't look like you and don't share your culture. It's wrong to torture humans and non-human animals just for fun. It's wrong to murder innocents. So for the sake of brevity, let's just let M be the belief that cannibalism, slavery, torture, and cold-blooded murder are wrong. Now let's say, just for the sake of argument, that you think M is true. You'd be in good company. Most of the roughly 7.5 billion people on Earth agree with you. So we have M. Cannibalism, slavery, torture, and cold-blooded murder are wrong. And you think, for the sake of argument, that M is true. Then you encounter an evolutionary debunking argument of the sort offered by Nietzsche, Bloom, Stark, Atran, Dawkins, Sloan Wilson, and so on. Should you abandon your belief in M? Now that you've read one of these evolutionary accounts of the origins of our beliefs in morality, should you abandon your belief that M is the case, namely that cannibalism, slavery, torture, and cold-blooded murder are wrong? Okay, so let's look at yet another one of these examples of evolutionary accounts of the origin of morality. This is a really famous one. So this is E.O. Wilson. He is a world-famous entomologist. He studies ants, but he's also a very famous evolutionary theorist. And he is also the sort of founding figure in the field of sociobiology, which we talked about before. Sociobiology is now typically referred to as evolutionary psychology, but E.O. Wilson sort of kicked it off in the 70s. He's been a major figure in the field all along. And one of the puzzles that has always been of interest to E.O. Wilson is the puzzle of altruism. Why is it that in our species, people sacrifice benefits to themselves for the sake of other people when there is no payoff for them in terms of evolutionary fitness? So it's not a puzzle, for example, that mothers really dedicate themselves and devote themselves to their children, because that kind of devotion can be explained in terms of evolutionary fitness. That is going to send their genes into the next generation. So that's not a puzzle. But there's all kinds of examples from human culture where people sacrifice a benefit to themselves when they get no payoff whatsoever in terms of their own evolutionary fitness. So, the classic example is a soldier jumping on a grenade, blowing up and dying so he can save the members of his military cohort. So that's not going to benefit him in terms of evolutionary fitness. He's dead, but he massively benefited the people with whom he was fighting. So that's a kind of evolutionary puzzle. Why would any species that evolved under the pressures of natural selection engage in that kind of altruistic behavior? And Wilson, in his recent book, The Social Conquest of the Earth, argues that to account for altruistic behavior, we need to talk about group-level selection. So he says evolutionary theory has been very good about theorizing natural selection at the individual level, but there's also natural selection happening at the group level in really social species like ourselves and in social species like ants. Okay, so talking about the human case, why does altruism emerge? Here's a very simplified version of Wilson's account. In our early environment of evolutionary adaptation, we lived in tribes. And our tribes were in constant warfare with other neighboring tribes. And so, Wilson argues, the groups that evolved really strong tendencies to bond with each other, to sacrifice for each other, to really look out for each other, to care for each other. Tribes that evolved those emotional response tendencies ended up having a massive competitive advantage against tribes that didn't. So it's a kind of Nietzschean argument again. So remember, Nietzsche said, where does morality come from? Well, we evolve morality because we like to punish people. So there's this kind of evil origin of morality. And E.O. Wilson is saying, morality evolved because it helped certain tribes be more successful in tribal warfare. And so this is a kind of dark passage in The Social Conquest of the Earth E.O. Wilson says, the most common paleoanthropological finding is a mass grave. Tribes were out there killing each other. They'd kill all the men, take the women prisoners, take everything that they had and so on. And this was the way that early human beings evolved. They evolved in the context of these tightly knit tribal groups. So that, like I said, that's a very crude version of the theory. But altruism evolved not at the individual level, but at the group level. And it evolved because groups with members who looked after each other did a better job of killing other groups that didn't look after each other. And why would that happen? Well, think of my example earlier of the soldier who jumps on the grenade to save his compatriots. When you have these tightly knit groups, you have people who are more likely to look out for each other even when things get really dangerous. So E.O. Wilson is saying, you only think that M is true. You only think that these moral beliefs that you have about cannibalism, slavery, torture, and so on, you only think that those beliefs are true because natural selection favored groups in which members of the tribe looked out for each other. Those tribes were more successful in tribal warfare. And so, as a kind of added bonus of this theory, the tribal character of morality also explains global warfare, why it is that nation states tend to always be in conflict with other nation states, xenophobia, right, the fear of foreigners. People in other tribes were likely to kill you. So, evolutionarily speaking, it makes sense that human beings would be afraid of people who don't look like them. Racism is another example of this, Trumpism, Brexit, and so on. So people use this theory not just to explain morality and where altruism comes from, but also just to explain why our goodness is so limited, right? So why is it the purview of our moral vision is so narrow, and we tend to only extend it to people who look like us, people who have experience like we do, and so on? Well, we evolved to be that way because our moral sensibilities didn't evolve so that we would have true moral beliefs. They evolved so that we would look out for people in our tribe, and also so that we would hate and try to fight and kill people who are not in our tribe. Okay, so Wilson's evolutionary debunking argument, if he were to make one, would look something like this. So the causal premise is that S's belief that M is caused by group-level selection pressures for tribal fitness. The epistemic premise is that those group-level selection pressures do not bear on the truth of M. They have nothing to do with getting moral beliefs correct. They have everything to do with bonding us to members of our tribe so that we can outcompete other tribes. Therefore, S's belief that M is not justified or warranted. Okay, so this is just another version of the same argument that we've been looking at. And it involves this claim about off-track processes, just like the other arguments did. So our moral belief-forming capacities, they didn't evolve to track the truth about moral properties. They evolved so that we would identify with our tribe, making us more effective at killing and subjugating other tribes. So there's no reason whatsoever to think that they track the truth about real moral properties, whatever those would be. Right? So the key to this idea of tracking is that our moral belief-forming capacities aren't sensitive to the facts about moral properties. We can believe that certain moral facts obtain even when they don't. So let me just give you an illustration of what I mean by this. Here is a world where moral properties exist. You could see something like this. So that's a world where moral properties exist. Here is a world where we only think that moral properties exist. Do you see the difference? Look really closely. Can you find the difference between the two? No, you can't, because a world where moral properties exist is indistinguishable from a world where moral properties are merely thought to exist. So moral beliefs aren't sensitive. You could easily think that there were moral properties in the world when, in fact, there are none, because you can't tell the difference between a world where moral properties exist and a world where we only think that they exist. So this leads to what's sometimes referred to as error theory. So take your M again, right? So this is the proposition that cannibalism, slavery, torture, cold-blooded murder are wrong. And the error theorist says that's false. That's an error. That's an erroneous judgment. Why? Not because the error theorists are evil. It's not that they don't deplore those things too. They do. They have the same kind of intuitive response that you do. The thought of cannibalism makes them sick. The thought of slavery makes them angry. The thought of torture makes them upset. The thought of cold-blooded murder keeps them up at night if they think about it. So they have the exact same intuitive responses that you have, but they think that M is false because they think that moral properties don't exist. There's no such thing as a moral property. So statements that assume the existence of moral properties are systematically false. They're systematically in error. That's an error theory. So we have this pervasive tendency to talk about morality and to think moral properties are real. And that's because we have this evolved tendency to think about morality in certain terms. But moral properties don't exist. Our so-called moral faculties don't track the truth about moral properties because there are none to track. We have this sort of moral speech, this tendency to talk and think about morality simply because we evolved in competitive groups. And the groups where people looked out for each other and tended to care about each other and tended to sacrifice for each other were more successful at killing the other groups. So, back to our main question. Does this give you a defeater? So remember, M is the belief. It's a basic moral beliefs. Slavery, torture, cannibalism, and cold-blooded murder are wrong. So say that I think M is true. Then I encounter this evolutionary debunking argument by Wilson and other arguments like it. Do I now have a rebutting, warrant, or rationality defeater for my belief that M? That's been the question of this term. When you encounter a kind of genealogical or evolutionary debunking argument of the sort that we've just been talking about, do you get a defeater for the beliefs that have been subjected to that debunking argument? That's our question. If you believe that M, if you believe that cannibalism, torture, murder, and slavery are wrong, do you think that in virtue of having read that genealogical debunking argument or that evolutionary debunking argument, do you think you now have a defeater for that belief?